Hey y'all, my name is Tim Villegas and this is Think Inclusive, our podcast that explores inclusive education practices through conversations with people who are doing the work of inclusion in the real world. I'm coming to you again from the Marietta Square. If you're watching on YouTube, the mural behind me is the name of my city in very colorful letters in the background. I'm also standing in front of railroad tracks. This week for Think Inclusive, I have two really wonderful guests, Liz Zogby from Maryland and Stephen Davis from California. They are both parents of children with disabilities, fantastic advocates, and self-described data nerds. I had a really great conversation with them about how data informs their advocacy, specifically around inclusive education, and how it has affected how they think about policy and how they've advocated for policy around inclusive education. Before we get into that discussion, I want to talk to you a little bit about our sponsor, IXL. So IXL is our sponsor for season 12. It's an online teaching and learning platform. I've been talking a lot about how teachers use this platform in schools, and there are certainly a lot of teachers that do that. I've said this before, but about 1 million teachers in the United States use it in their classroom. It's designed for kindergarten through 12th grade. But the other thing that's really nice about this platform is that it's also for parents. So parents can use this platform and use it at home. So definitely check out IXL. IXL.com/inclusive is where you can find out more information. Thank you again for our fantastic sponsor for the whole season of season 12. We are going to take a quick break, and then you'll be able to hear my conversation with Liz Zogby and Stephen Davis. We'll be right back. Liz Zogby and Stephen Davis, welcome to the Think Inclusive podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Great being here. You're really a YouTuber. You've got the blue light behind you.
That's right. I got my fancy camera. I've got my background light. I have my key light. I research all this stuff. To get us started, will you both, Liz and Steve, give a brief introduction of who you are and what you do in this space?
Sure. I live in Baltimore City. I have 3 kids, one who just graduated from college last weekend, another college student, and a 13-year-old 6th grader named Hope who has Down syndrome. That is my entry into this community and space. And I co-chair with my friend Lauren Ochelek of the Maryland Down Syndrome Advocacy Coalition. And so we're a statewide advocacy coalition. We have 5 major Down syndrome organizations in our state that are represented on our steering committee. And we do legislative and policy advocacy. I have a grant-funded project called the Special Education Policy and Advocacy Project. I'm also co-chairing the special education work group with our state superintendent that's been convened by our State Department of Education, reviewing special education and making recommendations for legislative and policy changes.
That's a lot. Thanks, Liz.
Wow.
Sure.
So my name is Steve Davis, far away in California. I'm sort of policy numbers advocate online and in the community here. I've been really working on trying to build a local policy advocacy infrastructure, Palo Alto, where I'm kind of obsessed with numbers and how the policy systems work. So that's how I met Tim, I think.
Yeah, I think, Stephen, you just started emailing me, and then I started emailing you back, and that's the story.
internet stalked each other.
Yeah, well, I'm so happy that both of you are on, in particular, because both of your love of data and how you both use the numbers to inform your advocacy. So why don't we start there? Both of you have used the data, the research to inform what you do for your own family. How did that information inform how you advocated for your children? I don't know who wants to go first.
Go ahead, Stephen.
I'll go first.
Yeah.
My degree's in math, so I kind of look at numbers. Anything else, I automatically look at numbers. A number of years ago, I don't remember, stumbled on the Department of Education's report on IDEA and stumbled into it and found that California was utterly dismal for inclusion. We have the most kids in public schools in a segregated setting in the United States. And that kind of blew my mind. And then I was like, oh, some of these questions look familiar. I wonder if this data exists at the school district level or in Department of Education jargon, the local education authority. And sure enough, buried on the California Department of Education website, I found data on my old school district, San Mateo Foster City School District, that said not only were we more segregated than, that I was living in the most segregated state for public education, but that my school district was 50% more segregated than California. And it kind of blew my mind. So I think the numbers were, if I remember, nationally, the average is a bit over 13% of kids spend less than 40% of their time in general education. The top states are around 5%. And California at that point was at, I think, 19.7%. San Mateo Foster City, I think, was at 26.6 or something like that. So it was kind of dismal, and I had no idea, and I don't think anyone else did. And it radically changed the way I thought about where I was at and what I was seeing, because I had no context before then. I think everybody's doing the best they can and everybody's doing well. And when you find an outlier of an outlier, it kind of changes the way you look at things and the way you talk to everyone.
So I think I have a similar story in that my master's degree was in library and information science. I've spent a long time doing polling as part of my freelance work. So I'm interested in what the data says about any particular issue. When my daughter was born in 2000, I started lurking on listservs and in Facebook groups, hearing these stories of segregation. I was instantly interested in what the data said. And I was particularly interested that when I looked at the overall reporting about students with disabilities in my state of Maryland, about 71% of students with disabilities are included in general education classrooms 80% or more of the time. But that didn't seem to be reflected in the experience I knew of families who had kids with intellectual disability. You have to dig a little bit deeper to say, okay, well, what is the placement data for students with different kinds of disabilities? Because of my background in polling data, I was interested in looking at cross-tabulated data. I wanted to know, well, when is this happening? At different grade levels, what does the placement data look like? And as soon as you start to dig deeper, you get a much better sense of the reality. And I was able to see that reflection. What's interesting for my story is that I didn't really need it for my personal advocacy because my older children had attended and my daughter still attends public charter school here in Baltimore City that is a progressive, arts integrated, project-based learning kind of school that's fully inclusive. From when she was a baby, my other children were in elementary school. The founder of our school and our principal both told me unequivocally, like, of course Hope's going to go to school here. You don't have to worry about that. In some ways, that freed me up to be able to say, okay, I'm good, but I'm good because of a lottery, like the luck of the draw. I'm hearing all of these stories of people who are fighting so hard to get their child with Down syndrome included in kindergarten, which just seems wild to me. I need to understand how that could be happening. A lot of our work with the Maryland Down Syndrome Advocacy Coalition, MDAC, is taking that data and giving folks the opportunity to tell their story. I think that marriage of data and stories is where advocacy really sits. It really resonates with legislators and policymakers, can hear the actual experiences of their constituents and see how that actually is reflective of a reality that they can understand in numbers. So we try to create opportunities for self-advocates in particular and for family members to tell their stories and then back that up with here's a one-pager that can show you that, yes, only 20% of students who have intellectual disability are included in the state of Maryland in general education classrooms.
Yep. Right.
The way I describe it when I futilely try to convince parents to come to school board meetings and speak up is I say I'm kind of, or every meeting, providing the numbers, I provide the baseline, and then it would really help if you came and you told your stories and provided the melody on there. Those personal stories told personally, as opposed to sort of a more, we're vaguely professional advocate. When I say there's an incident, it is respectfully listened to. When a mother or child himself speaks up, it's a slam dunk. We're just pushing the thing along day after day.
Stephen, part of your story, I believe, is that you moved school districts because of the data. Is that right?
So it's interesting. I'm not an advocate. I never get like the person to go with you to an IEP meeting. I like helping people be prepared and sort of knowledgeable going in. I think that's much more useful and meaningful. So one of the things I said is, well, you can fight the school district, but you can sort of IEP a school into doing a good job. I can write an amazing, glorious IEP with great goals and certain, but if the school district isn't meaningfully implement it, it doesn't mean anything. Well, if you're not happy here, why don't you straight to a different school district? It's much cheaper than hiring a lawyer, and you're more likely to get better results. And I did that to other people for years. And then I was like, hey, this applies to me too. And by the numbers, moving from San Mateo to Palo Alto made a real difference. I will modify my initial statement by saying, once you get in a good school district, or school, it starts getting to be, unfortunately, a bit of a personal services exercise and finding the right school and the right teachers and the right team, even if the numbers are a good start.
Since both of you are steeped in data and percentages, LRE, inclusion rates, we have a lot of listeners who are very interested in inclusive education, inclusive practices. I'm wondering if in your own research, if there's a data point that really sticks out that our listeners should know about.
That's so interesting. This is such an interesting question because, there is the ability to look up placement data and you can look it up for your state or your local education agency. That can be really important. To me, the most important thing isn't so much a particular, whether it's you're going to look at the LREA, that number of percentage of kids in 80% or more of the time, or you're going to look at the separate schools. To me, it's looking at variability. Mm-hmm. When you look at your state, what really matters is how does your state compare to other states? When you look at your district, how does your district compare to other districts in your state? The thing that can indicate for you is, data gestures at a problem. So when you see that kind of wild variability that we see in Maryland and we, see all over the country, in different ways, it can indicate to you where you need to look for the solution. So if what you see is in this district, twice as many students are being identified as having intellectual disability as the neighboring district, that tells you something's going on with the application of an eligibility tool for intellectual disability. And that will lead you to ask questions. Well, maybe you don't want to give consent for your student to have an IQ test because that's what it's going to be used for. And that's going to spiral into placement. I guess it's not so much the data point as what you do with it once you identify it. Looking at that kind of variability can really help you better understand that reality.
And you have to deal with the real constraints you have. I'm here in California because 92-year-old father, 15 minutes away, and my in-laws who are in their 80s and not thriving are all about 30 minutes away. So I'm kind of here for the duration. So I have to work with what I've got, even though, it's frustrating being a kind of that doesn't really have great public education and doubling for kids in special education. So we all have to work with constraints. I have actually, I think there's a couple of data points that I think I carry. One is the National Council on Disability did a study on segregated classrooms in 2018. If you don't have the link, Tim, I will share it with you, but you can find it by, I think, National Council of Disability Segregated Classroom as your Google search. And there are a couple of pieces of information in there. One, there is no data that having kids with disabilities in class with the general ed kids hurts the education of general ed kids. In fact, some modest indication that it helps.
Mm-hmm.
Two, that kids in segregated classrooms wind up with 35% fewer minutes of academic instruction per day. My snarky way of saying that is, you're starting behind and getting behind her, and we, unfortunately, or whatever, the U.S. system, we don't have good data between states and between, how different places are doing. But what I can say, it's pretty clear that on average, if I get substantially fewer minutes of actual minutes in school a day, I am not going to be getting as good of an education. So that to me is just such a powerful start. And then the other thing I've been telling parents of young kids is you have to have high expectations. And there's I think 320 or something college level programs for kids with intellectual and developmental disabilities in the United States. So it's not only can you have expectations that are high, but there are places you can go. Food service as an honorable profession is not the only answer for your kid.
Exactly. Yeah. And I know that Think College has a database on their website that has
it's awesome.
A lot of different programs available, the inclusive post-secondary education. There's a data point that sticks in my head. I'd like to share that with you. And it's actually one of a district here in Georgia. I'm not going to name the district because it's not about calling out a particular district, but I know of a family who their child has Down syndrome and was working and pursuing full inclusion in this district. There was a conversation that the special education director was having with the family around inclusion. The child was not included to the level or to the amount of time that the family wanted. The special education director said, well, we have a inclusive placement rate of over, I think it was 90%. Or maybe over 80. It was really high for Georgia. The state percentage is in the 60s, which is pretty average for the United States. But this particular district was very high. What stuck out to me in that conversation was that this district had a high inclusive placement rate for students with intellectual disabilities.
Yeah.
It didn't make the difference that the family wanted. So we're looking at all this data, and it's wonderful data. And I'm very thankful that we can have consistent data around inclusive placement rates in school districts. But that doesn't tell us the whole story. It doesn't tell us what kind of inclusive practices are happening, whether those learners are feeling a sense of belonging, whether their curriculum is being modified, whether there's co-teaching available. There's all of this information that is missing when we're looking at just LRE data. So I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
Well, that's right. That's the story, the experience of kids and families, and it's critical. I mean, the data just, all it does is point to possibility or challenge, but it doesn't tell you about the experiences of kids. And that's really what it's about. Sure, I'd trade 15 minutes of, inclusion time for a student feeling truly belong in their middle school and that they're participating in, they have friendships. And I mean, I think every parent probably feels that. Time is something we're measuring, but the time isn't the thing that you have to be there. You have to have that presence, right? I think Eric Carter's elements of belonging begin with that, his presence. You have to be there, but they can't end there. That's the baseline. So
Right.
for sure. And Tim, I think one of the things that really has stuck out for me is the placement for students who take the alternate assessment. Those students with the most significant cognitive disability. And I know that MCIE works really hard on focusing on the inclusion of those students. The reason is if you can get educators and systems to figure out how to support kids who have the most significant support needs, other kids become a no-brainer. If we can figure out how to meaningfully include kids who need a lot of modification and support, we can figure out how to, include all kinds of kids. That data is something that you have to request. And I encourage folks to learn how to put in a data request. Here in Maryland, we have a Public Information Act, but I think in most states, there's something like the equivalent of a FOIA request that you can make to find out what that data is. And you can make a request to find out what is the placement for students who are eligible to take the alternate assessment. We don't know because the federal government doesn't require that people track that, but it's out there. It just takes a little digging in a database. And the last time someone tried to do some systemic research about it, they found that less than 3% of students who take the alternate assessment are included. And I think people generally think that that's a really low number. And it's startling to legislators and policymakers when they hear that. There's no reason for that kind of segregation when all the research about that particular very small group of students indicates that those students have such better outcomes when they are included in general education classrooms. We can do it. We know how. We need the will to do it.
When I'm talking to people about IEPs, I go, okay, the IEP is an agreement between you and the United States. It's a contract, basically. But like any contract, it can't make someone do a good job. So, got to look at the person on the other side of the table or team on the other side of the table and say, do they have goodwill, adequate resources, and competence? And that's the question. If, having your bathroom remodeled, you can write a wonderful document about remodeling your bathroom. But if the person doesn't want to do a good job, isn't competent, and doesn't have resources, it doesn't matter. So I think people get a little wrapped up in the legalism of the formalism of the IEP and a little kind of underplaying how important it is that the people on the other side of the table want to educate your kid, because it really want to educate your kid. And I will say my experiences, I've been able to tell that the numbers tell me everything. We can write a beautiful IEP. I can be on paper heavily included, but it's really about working those people to get those people that your child's teacher to really want to teach your kid, want to include and the school wanting them there. And if they don't, it doesn't matter what we write, unfortunately. The numbers work both ways in that regard.
The data that we're talking about is publicly available. And Liz, thank you for that recommendation, because I think that could be very powerful to request that kind of information about the inclusive placement rates of children who are eligible to take the alternate assessment. How have you seen data move policy, if at all, in your local context?
Well, it's interesting. I think that there has been attention to students who take the alternate assessment in Maryland over the last number of years. You had some really wonderful educators from Carroll County here in Maryland who worked with the TIES Center. They talked a little bit about the way that they're using data in a kind of interesting way, I think, for those students, thinking about how sometimes data reveals and it also hides. We think about placement in these basically arbitrary categories, less than 40%, 40 to 79 and 80% or above, but that they were really starting to track in a more finely grained way as they increased meaningful inclusion for students, it meant a lot to move a student who was only included 45% of the time to 70% of the time, even though the data we typically track won't actually show because that child is still in LREB. So I think that there's ways that people are trying to work around those things. But I also think that it's important for folks to track the targets that their state sets in their ESSA plans and in their annual determination letters that the U.S. Department of Education puts out, so that people can really see, use that data, bring it to your policymakers, show them they don't understand much of this data and they don't think about it. So I think it's a matter of explaining what it means and then tying it to something, whether it's the training requirements, the licensure requirements for teachers in your state, or what the funding is for students in your state. Thinking about using placement data and tying it to policy objectives and using it to show that there's a problem can be really powerful for policy advocates.
I did a report last, as I think the IDEA compliance material comes out in July when we're all busy thinking about beaches instead of IDEA compliant. I put together a report. I just went the IDEA compliance data was like the last 7 years. And it is, what are we? I think we're 48 years into IDEA, something like that.
Because it's 1975.
49. And I think they do it like only 27 states are actually in compliance with IDEA, actual full compliance with IDEA after 48 years. And compliance is like passing your written test for your driver's license. It's not that you're doing a good job. It's that, you know whether you're allowed to right turn on red or not, and that you're filling out the paperwork right. And a number of states, including mine, have never, during the 7-8 year period I was looking at, ever been actually in full compliance with IDEA. I think it was like 12 or 13 states that had never passed completely, and that we don't talk about this. And I think actually us simply talking about it's sort of like my old school district. They didn't know what they didn't know. Everybody kind of runs on folklore, and they all assume they're doing just fine. For example, I know a lot of people focus on how many kids are in the most inclusive environments. I kind of go the opposite. I go, how few kids are in the least inclusive environment. I think about it, it's like we judge car safety by not who's got the most miles on the road, but by who has the fewest car accidents. So what states have the fewest kids in segregated settings? What states have fewest kids in separate schools? Kind of to me is a better measure. Like I looked at California and New York because someone was asking me about New York, and they both have as their target for number of kids in most segregated settings, 18%. And I'm like, well, I'm a good bureaucrat. Why is that? It's probably about 10% better than where they were at, as they're at from a national point of view. Like we're aiming for still being the worst in the United States in California and New York for kids in the most segregated setting. Thinking about it, and I don't even know that many people know where the states stand on these issues.
You know what? I have one more thought, which is another way that I've used data on a direct policy way. Every year, states are supposed to keep that eligibility for the alternate assessment to under 1% of students who are assessed overall. And I've really found that the waiver request that states are required to submit if they're going to exceed that 1% is a really amazing opportunity for advocacy and for seeking policy change. So the only accountability around the alternate assessment is the number of students who take it. But it provides this window to talk about why states are exceeding the 1%. And when they have exceeded it multiple times, they have to have an action plan that talks about how they're going to get that number down. and they have to have the opportunity for the public to comment on that waiver request and that action plan. And it's a really wonderful opportunity for advocates or parents or whoever to submit public comment. You can find your waiver request on your State Department of Education website. Usually there'll be, a couple week or a 30-day window for public comment, and read through it and just make a comment about how, students who take the alternate assessment should be included. And, take a look at what the eligibility tool is that's used in your state. But here in Maryland, that's been a really wonderful way to give some feedback to our State Department about ways that we think that they could lower that number and meaningfully include access to the general education curriculum for students who take the alternate assessment.
That's a great idea.
Yeah. And I don't know the machinations here in Sacramento, how things happened, but for a long time, all of the LEA data for Department of Education for IDEA were buried in these Word documents, PDF documents on a back page kind of the state website, while we have this beautiful, fancy school dashboard for all the general ed kids that allows you to do all this. Well, it doesn't make it too easy to do comparisons, but you can go look at how, from an academic point perspective, students with disabilities are doing in different schools and school districts. You can't cross-tab that with inclusion data, but finally this year they put in a database some of the inclusion data, so it was more accessible. And so just actually, I think fighting to get the data out there and more available is important, just because people are better equipped to do individual advocacy when they know this, when the data is findable.
Yeah.
So it gives you it's just asking for data is a start.
For educators who are listening, because we do have a lot of educators who are either working in schools, they're school leaders, principals, even, superintendent, assistant superintendent level directors. What's kind of the big takeaway from this discussion about data? Like, what would you, if you were able to speak to them directly, what would you want to say to them?
Well, I mean, I'd love for educators to know the data about placement in their district and in their state, and to be curious in the same ways that we've been talking about parents and advocates being curious, about why that data exists. And then in terms of making it actionable when you're sitting at an IEP table, I mean, I think it's important for educators to know, the consequences of the decisions being made for an individual student. Because I think a lot of times, I mean, from my perspective, people don't decide to be educators because they want to harm kids, right? They become educators because they want to do right by kids. And I think sometimes when it comes to that individual table, sometimes educators think, well, this kid really needs to be segregated. This kid really needs all this extra support. And the only place that they can get that support is over there because we don't know how to do it here. So we've got to send them over there. I think if educators knew the data for their context well and recognized that once that kid goes over there, they're not coming back, and that the outcomes for the kids over there aren't great, and that actually that team they have assembled around the table, can grow and learn and build more support, they would be the person questioning that decision at the table, so the parent isn't the only one. And it leaves the parent able, to be the expert about the thing they're supposed to be an expert about, which is their child, not about knowing the data for their district or knowing how to, implement those supports in a classroom. Because that's not, I always think whenever we talk about special education reform and people talk about, well, parents need to, we need more parent training, or parents need more, take these classes in the law. Or I always think, I don't want special education reform to rest on the backs of parents. Parents are being parents, and we need to figure out solutions to the problems that we see in special education that rest in the system and that help us to allocate resources better and to train people better and to, build teams that function better. So if educators can understand the system and the context in which they work a little bit better and can be that curious voice at the table, I think that can really help. Every team has to have someone sitting around who is the public agency representative, right? That's one of the required members of the IEP team. And if educators could ask that person, well, we want to provide this student with more services and supports, and we don't have the resources in this school to do that. How is the public agency going to help us provide the support so this student can stay in his neighborhood school? That I think that would be really a wonderful way to kind of help us reform the system from the inside and the outside.
It's interesting. The teachers I've most, no one gets into special education for the big bucks. They are, when they certainly go in, I believe they're all passionately committed to helping the kids with the greatest challenges. The teachers that frustrated me the most are those who seem to want to protect our kids from the world as opposed to prepare them for it. Mm-hmm. And I think, it's like when I have a weak general ed teacher for my typical kid as opposed to my special ed kid, it's a rough year. But when I have a weak teacher for my special ed kid, it's like it can be a lost year, and it's really costly. I think being aware of the consequences of not preparing our kids for the real world is something I think they just sort of, it's like a hot potato game. You move the kid from one system to the next system, or this year to the next year, push them forward, let someone else deal with it. But the problem is, at the end of the day, our kids, face a 37% employment gap, a massive income gap, a huge poverty rates. So everything we can do to get them a real education really, really, really pays off. You look at the numbers, not from the schools, but from the output of our school system for disabled people, and getting that real high school diploma matters profoundly. We had the experience, I guess, maybe like you, Liz, where they were pushing my son in second grade saying, well, you'll be able to stay in high school till you're 21 and, don't worry about it. And, we'll get you a certificate. And I'm like, he's in second grade. Let's get him a high school diploma. We can have this discussion in 10 years. I'm not ready to give up, and I don't want you to be ready to give up on my kid. We need to have high expectations because the consequences are big. And I don't think a lot of educators are aware of the consequences of weak special education. And I don't think actually legislators are either, because if they were, they'd be pouring money into special education, because if you get kids with disabilities a real degree, then they can be much more independent. They don't need as many services for the rest of their lives, and they can be income makers and parents and family members, as opposed to being sort of by design on the dole for the rest of their life.
Yeah, that makes me think about sometimes people talk about beginning with the end in mind, and in our Down syndrome community, one of the things that people we do tons of workshops about, and is preparing those little about me documents, that sort of talk about kids' strengths and writing a vision statement for your child. And we always start our IEP meetings by reading our vision statement for our daughter. And I think that educators could be really instrumental too in helping families as they're recognizing, some parents know that their expertise is their child. And sometimes parents need to be encouraged to dig into that expertise and to find different ways to show it. So I think educators could be really instrumental in helping parents to find ways to talk about the expertise that they have about their child, and to think about, as Stephen was saying, that long term, where do I want my child to be as an adult? What do I see that trajectory being? So that the decisions that we're making in the second grade are the ones that are going to contribute to that child's life in 20 years. And the extra pull-out time, a little here, a little there. Okay. But when we're talking about radical shifts in placement and making lifelong decisions, like this child is not going to get access to the full curriculum and is not going to get a diploma, and those decisions are being made for children who are 7 years old, that's unacceptable. And educators can really help parents to realize that those decisions need to be pushed against, and we should be doing it together.
Yeah. And it was interesting in the high school diploma thing. It was really interesting. There is in California, and it probably varies by state, there's a teeny little check the box near the back of our IEP that says promotion criteria based upon district standards or IEP goals. And this is like the single most important check the box in the IEP. And we saw it because I'm a paranoid reader of words in the IEP, and we went ballistic and have been continually ballistic since it's been in there. But I sort of talked to some other parents, and I said, there's this check the box that basically tells you whether the school thinks your kid's on a degree track, and they may check it in second grade, maybe earlier. And I've had parents go, and then they come back to me a day or two later and go, yeah, that box was checked and no one said a darn thing. It's like, it's basic, important information. This is why I hate calling us, we're equal members of the IEP team. It's like, I'm the most passionate advocate for my kid, but I go to, in a bad year, 3 or 4, maybe 5 IEP meetings, but my teacher goes probably to 20 or 30 every year. They've got professional training. My speech, all those people have had tons of years of training. Their job is to be the experts. We are a team unified in goal, but we're not team unified in expertise and we're there because we actually bring different things to the table. And so expecting us to carry the load for all of this is kind of absurd.
Well, before we get to our last segment, where can people find more information about what organizations and groups you're part of? So, Liz, you can go first, and then Stephen, make sure to tell everyone about Disability Almanac and whatever else you have.
So, the Maryland Down Syndrome Advocacy Coalition has a public Facebook page, so that's probably the best way. We are in the midst of building our website, but we're mostly volunteer crew. So, but that's probably the best way. And then I'd love for people to follow the work of our Blueprint Special Education Work Group in Maryland. We have a website, and I'll send you that link, Tim, so you can put it with the notes or whatever. But it's called the Blueprint Special Education Work Group in Maryland. There's little policy papers that are being put out each month on different topics, the recommendations that are coming out. I think, in many ways what we're doing is, hasn't been done in a lot of places, and I hope that it will have a bigger impact even than just in Maryland.
All right. So I have a website called disabilityalmanac.com. And like you, Tim, I'm experimenting with YouTube. So I have a YouTube channel called Disability Almanac, cleverly. I've been actually focusing initially on ABLE accounts because they're pretty amazing if you've got a kid with a substantial disability. And again, numbers. 8 million people are eligible. There's 152,000 ABLE accounts as of last June. So that's 1.7% after 10 years after the law is passed.
Wow.
I'm because there's so many things to talk about with disability, I just picked that one to sort of start with. Because it's such you can, in California, and I think in most places, you can set one up in 15 minutes, go to your basically state ABLE account website and set it up. And if you haven't done that, you probably haven't done all the other things that you need to start thinking about for long-term, financial and life planning, which is a lot bigger issue for kids with more substantial disabilities. Because, you have to kind of keep your kid poor to ensure access to disability services, which is a whole nother can of worms to talk about another day.
Mm-hmm.
We have to, I think, families of kids with more serious disabilities, more extreme, what is the right word? I don't know. Kids with more substantial disabilities, you need to start thinking early about kind of putting the pieces in place for them for their whole life, and thinking much more intentionally about life after high school and all that, because you don't want to be sort of hit by surprise by the way our system works.
Awesome. All right. So, are you all ready for a mystery question?
I'm so nervous. As a long-time listener, I'm real nervous.
They're not that bad.
Sometimes. I'm not a quick thing.
But here's the thing: the magic of editing is that if it's a bad question, we just pick another one.
Okay, great.
Yeah. So I don't. Yeah. All right. Here we go.
No stress. Okay.
What specific work of art do you admire the most?
Oh.
Let's see if I can get it to focus. There we go.
Oh, I've got it.
Hold on. There we go. What specific work of art do you admire the most? Do you want me to go first?
Sure.
Because I have something in mind.
Go first,
I'm a proud father. So I'm talking about my kids. My middle schooler, 8th grade, he's an excellent cello player. And he played something recently. I think it was Vivaldi. It was like a Vivaldi piece. And so we're going to be going to some Atlanta Symphony Orchestra concerts coming up soon. And I was like, checking him up on YouTube because now I'm a YouTuber, so I might as well be watching YouTube videos. So I got onto Atlanta Symphony Orchestra's YouTube channel, and they had this replay of Vivaldi's Four Seasons piece, and it's like 50 minutes long. It's long, but I just could not stop watching this piece because I know how I've never played a stringed instrument, like an orchestra instrument. I can play piano, guitar, and I've been in rock bands, but not I've never played classical music. And I know how hard it is for my son when he's practicing a piece. It's like he works so hard to perform it, and just pristine sound that an orchestra, a very high, professional orchestra can make with this music, it's phenomenal. And I'm just like, it's so much appreciation because it's unbelievable to me. So that's the first thing that came to my mind.
Okay. I've so many things going through my mind. I'm going to try to do I have 3 things, but I'm going to do them really fast.
Okay.
And edit as you see fit. The first thing that came to mind that, so I was going to tell this little story before and I didn't. When I got my degree in library and information science, I did that because I grew up in Washington, D.C., where, everybody has like an issue that they work on, right? They're like a lobbyist or they're like work for a nonprofit, they work for the government. And I thought that I would go to college and like discover my issue, and then come home and do that thing. And I didn't because I studied anthropology. So it was like all of a sudden everything was like relative, it was like I couldn't figure out what. So library and information science, I thought, oh, this is good because I can help people kind of research their issue. So as part of that, I had one of my really early jobs was, I worked for the chief, a curator of sculpture at the Hirshhorn Museum in Washington, D.C., which is one of the Smithsonian museums. And she was a scholar of Alberto Giacometti, who's an Italian, mostly known for being a sculptor. He was also a painter. And she was really interested in his paintings and she was working on that. And so I worked for her for about a year, cataloging these images of his paintings. And they all are very similar to one another. And so, and she was tracking where they were in different collections. And so it was kind of a puzzle to sort of follow them and try to figure out, where they were so that she could get the rights to put them in her book. So Giacometti for me is like, it just became something that because I started to learn about it, became so much more interesting to me, even though it wasn't something that I, originally knew anything about. It just was interesting to me that in some ways, the more you learn about a piece of art, the more you can develop an emotional connection to it when you might not have started out with one. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that's great.
So that was, okay. So that's my number 1. My number 2 is Judith Scott. She's that woman with Down syndrome who now there actually is a big exhibit of her work at the American Visionary Arts Museum, which is a really wonderful museum if anyone ever comes to visit Baltimore, of untrained artists. But Judith Scott was from California, and she was institutionalized as a child and spent most of her, like several decades in institutions. And then after her parents died, her sister found her and brought her to live with her. And she started going, she was, basically, non-speaking. And, she started going to a community center and people should look her up because I'm not going to do justice to her story, but she, it was an incredible artist. And she did these really fabulous sculptures that are wrapping yarn of different colors around different objects. And she created these really incredible works of art. And I think her story is it's really profound, and seeing those works of art is really profound. And then my last one, because of your performing arts one, which I hadn't thought of when you read the question. My daughter was just in the middle school play at her school. And, it was just a really wonderful sort of continuity. So each one of my children went through this school, participated in theater. It's a really small school, and each one kind of in their own way. They, like my oldest daughter, directed a play when she was in middle school. And it was this really amazing experience. And then my son was an actor. He actually went to the performing arts high school here in Baltimore City, called Baltimore School for the Arts, as a theater major, but he was in the middle school play. And then when my daughter wanted to do the play, was like, okay, we'll try out for the play. And she got a part, and it was a student written play, and she was the DJ. The play was called Murder on the Dance Floor. And he only makes it through the first 5 minutes of the play. It's the first dictum. But she had a few lines, and she, but the experience of belonging in this cast, you know, practicing after school a couple days a week for months, and then being in the play was really profound. And she, I think it was such a growing experience for her, but also for all these members of the cast. And so one of the things that came up a lot was she talked a lot about how she was really nervous. She was excited and she was nervous, and she talked about it all the time. And at one point I thought, oh my gosh, it must be driving them crazy because she's sort of perseverating on it. But I think it actually provided this opportunity for kids in the middle school group who might not have felt comfortable saying, like, I feel really nervous about, like, I'm excited, but I'm nervous, right? That, of course, everyone was feeling that. And she was able to verbalize that. And then they were all able to sort of talk about what they were going to do to kind of strategize around that. So like, that's what happens in inclusive community, you know, people, and making art together. It's, you know, what a wonderful way to be part of something. So, okay. Those are my 3 things.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing all that.
Yeah.
All right, Stephen.
Well, thanks for leaving me a big hole to try to follow on what. So I will give you, I guess, one that you can check out and one that you can't probably. Before we found out my son was autistic and my life veered into disability policy advocacy, or whatever we call this job. I thought I was going to make original board games out of wood and craft. And I've gotten, since I don't have time to do that, I've gotten rather obsessed with watching YouTube craft videos of sort of higher craft as opposed to probably anything that I could pull off. There is a machining channel, so metalworking, called ClickSpring on YouTube, since, you know, we're YouTubers now, called ClickSpring. And this guy, makes beautiful clocks. He's working on a version of, that machine that was found underneath the, ocean, and like this computing machine that Greeks had made, the something mechanism. And both the things he makes and the way he makes them are a delight, and I enjoy just watching the craft of making craft. And then, you know, because I need to be competitive here. My autistic son is a deeply committed whiteboard artist, and draws with amazing focus and passion on whiteboards, and we buy them by the, you know, like bulk whiteboards and bulk whiteboard pens, because he's really hard on them, and draws all over the place. Much better on the boards than the walls. I'll take it.
Yeah.
But anytime we want to try to take a picture of one, he immediately scrubs off the drawings with his hand. So it's I don't know if it's standard art or performance art, but
it's all about the process. I love it.
That's right.
It's all about the process. Yeah.
Oh, I love it. I love that we're all proud parents.
And also, I was so scared about mystery question, and then it turned out to be the very best part of the whole thing.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. I love the mystery question. I do.
We didn't have a data question on art.
Yeah.
Liz Zogby and Stephen Davis, thank you so much for spending time with me on the Think Inclusive podcast.
Thanks. This was so fun.
Thank you for having us.
We are back. Oh man, it's hot. I need some cloud cover. Welcome back, everyone. I'm realizing that I'm getting a little bit more comfortable talking in front of the camera these days. I guess I am fortunate to get a lot of practice. We got some cloud cover, so it's not so hot. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Liz and Stephen. I particularly liked the end of our conversation about the mystery question about art that we appreciate. It reminds me of why I love this job so much, having conversations and getting to know people in a different way, aside from their work of advocacy or in the field, is just so rewarding. Okay, it's time for 3 reflections from my conversation with Liz and Stephen. Number 1, I believe, is something that Liz talked about when comparing percentages, LRE percentages, across state and school districts. No matter what state you live in, there's a way to find out the LRE percentages. When you see big discrepancies, like the story I talked about in Georgia, where one district had a really high percentage and that was an outlier, what is it about that particular district that causes that percentage to be so high, even though, according to the family, they weren't including students with intellectual disabilities? Why was that number so high? I think that is an interesting question. Stephen talked about not looking at the LRE data or how many students are in general education, but how many students are in the most segregated spaces and what percentage of that is. If you look at the state data and compare that with the local data, what percentage of students with disabilities are either in that lower LREC, the most segregated spaces and settings, and then also separate schools. I think that is also an interesting reflection. Liz and Stephen used their own strengths to enter into this work of advocacy. What are your strengths that you can use to move inclusive education and practices forward in your own context? That's what we talk about with students too, right? Using students' strengths and building upon the strengths for that student so they can move forward in their goals. It's the same thing for us, using our strengths to move what we care about forward. That's certainly my story. Audio and video production has been a strength of mine. So I am constantly trying to improve these media strategies to move inclusive education forward. All right, 2 for you. Okay, here we go. 2 things for you to do. So the first thing is I would encourage you to try to figure out, wherever you live, if you're an educator or if you're a parent, what is the LRE statistics for your local school district. I'm going to put up a link in the show notes to a blog post I wrote. This was years ago when I first joined MCIE, that listed all the states and where you can find it. It's definitely not updated because it's something that would take quite a bit of time. I have not invested the time to update it, but at least will get you on the path to know where to look. So that would be my first thing for you to do. The second is a resource that Stephen talked about, which is the white paper by the National Council on Disability that talks about the segregation of students with disabilities. Definitely check that out. I'm going to have that in the show notes as well. That is the 2 things that you can do when you do either of those things, when you look up the LRE data or review the PDF from the National Council on Disability. Let me know what you think. I'd love to know what you thought of this episode or any of the episodes in season 12. You can always email me at tvillegas@mcie.org. That's tvillegas@mcie.org. That's it for this episode of Think Inclusive, coming to you from the railroad tracks at the Marietta Square. Thank you so much to IXL for being our sponsor for season 12. We are so appreciative. Definitely check them out at ixl.com/inclusive. Original music by Miles Kredich. Additional music from Melody. Thanks for your time and attention, and remember, inclusion always works. That's it. Let's go. From MCIE.